Hey everyone, welcome back to the Jacobin Show and Happy New Year. Obviously, a lot going on in the news today, especially right now. So we have kind of an unusual show today because of what's been happening. I did want to mention that we did an interview with Krystal Ball, the co-host of Rising, and we actually pre-recorded that interview yesterday. So unfortunately, we won't be able to ask her questions about the events that are happening right now. But that is coming up later, and we got Ariella on for that, so please stick around. Krystal talks a little bit about left and right populism, obviously very salient for the last 4 years, but again, especially today. And she sort of draws out the distinction between what is and what is not populism. So I think that conversation adds a really helpful texture to some of what's going on right now. But for right now, I'm joined by Paul and Cale, and we're going to just try to make some sense of what's been happening over at the Capitol. So, hey guys.
Hey,
John.
How's it going?
So what have you guys been seeing? I mean, I tuned in a little late, but obviously there is a lot going on in DC right now. It looks like some Trump supporters, maybe anywhere between 1,000 and 2,000, have stormed the Capitol. I think it's still unclear at this point how exactly they got past security, how they got in, to what extent, or to what is actually happening inside right now. But this is unfolding.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a very tumultuous moment. It's hard to really say much right now, of course, because it's ongoing. Obviously, it's shocking, and we hope that people, especially in the DC area, are safe and well right now. In some ways, this is, obviously I just said it's shocking, and in some ways it's not shocking, because this has been something that's been premeditated in a certain sense, that there has been a faction of both elected Republicans and, of course, people in Republican or conservative media that have been kind of stoking this on. And, it's something where, again, even without that, it's somewhat not surprising that just kind of the tenor of the Trump campaign, both Trump campaigns, it's a very visceral response to what is really basically kind of the just full collapse of society over the last few decades, both economically but socially and politically. That and then kind of infused with far-right nationalism, infused with really hateful bigotry and white supremacy, and all of these really horrible reactionary ideologies. But again, that only makes sense because these people, and I want to be clear though, I mean, I don't want to characterize who the people that are involved in this are right now, but where you get any kind of popular support for this, it comes out of very desperate people who are in, shitty economic situations. My guess would be that, if this is anything like similar Trump, pro-Trump protests in the last year or so, and honestly throughout most of this term, it's probably going to be more middle class. It's probably going to be like small business owners, which are like the bedrock of Trump's support. And again, like the kind of people that have the time and the resources to actually do something like this. But I think we can simultaneously say, like, there is the undeniable massive collapse of society, and there is this really horrific ideology that people unfortunately respond to because
right.
And I think it's incumbent on the left to have to make arguments, maybe not that's going to appeal to some small business owner necessarily that's involved in this, but to people that find some of this appealing, that actually a better world is possible. But
right.
And and we should say, like Jen said, there's so much information still coming out. We don't want to give all hot takes right now, but and like this is very cliche. I almost like don't want to say it, but like it really, it's just like yet another symptom of this very deep rot in this country. Like Cale said, and it's like the 40 years of neoliberalism just accelerated, and it's like that classic Gramsci quote about morbid symptoms, and we're just living through them. And I think people are very just unmoored politically, economically, socially, culturally, and I don't know, the old rules of politics just don't seem to apply anymore. And like, we can't keep proceeding in this way without more stuff like this happening. And even Biden's, I don't know if any of you saw Biden's like speech today, even something about that just felt kind of like out of touch and not in step or up to like what we need to do. And I think part of what's been hard with me thinking about this, I do think that there were times that some of this talk in the last 2 months of a coup has felt a little overblown and maybe, sometimes not very grounded. And, we don't know what's going to happen. Like maybe tomorrow the votes are going to be certified and this is going to just seem like a weird, crazy blip. And I think what's unhelpful about how the mainstream media has talked about the coup is like, I think they could talk about it more seriously, is like how much of this is kind of like almost a warm-up act or a test run for if things keep declining and there is no response from the left of at least like a social democratic answer to our problem, like, it's just a preview of what we're going to see from the right, and which has been like what the right has done in Latin America for decades. Who's to say that these kinds of things won't come out if a leftist like Bernie were to be elected in the future? That's kind of what worries me, but it's very hard to put your finger on how that might play out in the future. And, I don't know if it was like this insane level of incompetence, but I do feel like that the police were tacitly supportive of this in a way. Maybe if they didn't think it would escalate to what it did. And what I always tell people is that, in Greece, in the fascist party Golden Dawn, 30% of police members were members of Golden Dawn. And I wouldn't be surprised if something like that happened here. And we do have a clip of protesters like taking selfies with the police. And again, I don't know. We don't know the whole story, but it is a little, it shakes you a little bit to see that kind of stuff.
Yeah, I think for me, that is kind of the most disturbing element of what's going on right now, like the level of cooperation that we're seeing with politicians like Trump and Hawley, who, have sort of issued their sort of requisite, like, we don't support this, please stay peaceful, but obviously provoked this entire thing with their rhetoric over the past basically since the election, right? And then Hawley's recent declaration that he was going to object to the Electoral College count. And, I think, so when it comes to actually, just the protesters or the protests themselves, like, something I've been thinking about is when George W. Bush was reelected in 2004, I was in Portland, Oregon, and there was a big demonstration against Bush, even though that time he had been elected like fair and square. Like, he won not just the Electoral College, but also the popular vote, which of course was not the case in 2000. But in 2004, he did win. And, there was a big demonstration in Portland where everybody who hated Bush kind of rolled out. And in a way, like we didn't storm the Capitol, but like it's the Pacific Northwest. So like I think some Starbucks were smashed, and there were scuffles between protesters and the police, and like lots of calls for like overthrowing the government. And at the time, I remember being like I was there protesting, but I remember being like, well, is this somehow like subverting or like challenging democracy? Because I mean, he did win fair and square, like I said. And this older activist was like, no, protesting is democracy also. And I think that that's true. And, I thought about that right after the election when Trump supporters were protesting the election results, and I think like liberal commentators were getting angry at them and saying they were subverting democracy. Like I'm not trying to equate the two, because I think that there are differences, namely that the Trump protesters are usually armed. But I think, again, what makes this so different is that unlike, the ragtag Bush protesters, these protesters seem to have at least the tacit endorsement of quite a few people in power, and as you were saying, perhaps also the police and like some aspects of Capitol security.
Right. Yeah, and you know, like even the last 10 years, even globally, like we are in an incredibly volatile political age. I don't know what you want to call it, but you know, you have new parties, new left and right wing parties emerging all over the world. And, you know, I think, you know, who knows what Trump wanted to happen today, but there's a level where some things get beyond elite control. And I think, and, you know, he's been playing this very dangerous game, and you can see a result of it today. And I think it just speaks to like the volatility of our age that, I mean, as much as we know the ruling class knows how to run shit and they get what they want, so many things right now feel open-ended, which could be a great opportunity for left. It could be just like the beginning of the end of what was the left. But yeah, a lot of things are just getting beyond elite control. And I think I said to some people in 2016, like, I'm just giving up trying to predict what's going to happen in politics. And now I feel, you know, more validated in that. So that's all I'll say there.
Yeah, I think the point that you made earlier about how like basically, you know, institutions have crumbled, and I think we hear a lot from, you know, the liberal commentariat that, oh, like there's so much animosity and like political polarization right now. And that's true to an extent. But I think it is largely the result of all of these, not just working class, but social institutions in general being hollowed out by capitalism. So people are extremely atomized now. They, you know, I don't think that there's a sense that, you know, your vote really counts, right? And we have, on top of that, all of this social science research that says basically that elites do control politics. Like Benjamin Page and Martin Giles, I think, you know, they're two researchers who basically found that the top 10% of the economic distribution wields disproportionate influence on politics, and, you know, everybody else's vote basically amounts to nothing. That might be a too simplistic way of looking at it, but I think
the bottom 40 to 50% basically have no political power or representation in this country.
Right. And, you know, on this show and on other shows on the Jacobin channel, you know, we've made the point that the working class is not represented in Congress. Like we hear a lot about representation in Congress when it comes to, you know, racial and gender diversity, but workers aren't represented. So again, you know, what's happening now at the Capitol is extremely horrifying. And I should say, you know, is not populist, okay? Like I know that the mainstream media has kind of portrayed populism over the last 4 years as like, you know, an incendiary mob with pitchforks. But what's happening now is profoundly anti-democratic. And that's actually something that Krystal gets into a little later in our interview, so.
Well, it's also where, you know, there was this really great book that came out a while back by Peter Mayer called Ruling the Void. And the phenomenon that he was describing that people like our friend and comrade Anton Jaeger has continued that research in Jacobin and elsewhere is that basically, I mean, this hollowing out, what it ends up doing is that like the actual politicians and what they're doing becomes so separated from what actual people are going through, what they're dealing with, what they're interested in. The parties come to no longer represent particular political orientations. They're just kind of these blob catch-all things. And I mean, there's no greater representation of politicians ruling a void than seeing the protesters storm into Congress today. Like that, it's a hall of Congress with no one in it except for protesters who are, again, ideologically, politically, basically completely different than the three of us, but it does speak to like people, and deeply frustrated people they have no connection to what politics is in this country right now. And so we're going to keep seeing these like sporadic and oftentimes violent, oftentimes, again, deeply hateful expressions, oftentimes from the right. And, you know, we also see protests like we saw over the summer with Black Lives Matter, which, of course, you know, by and large was not violent, So, I mean, but the thing is that, and I'm pulling a phrase from actually Bayard Rustin, of going from protest to politics. And this is something actually that the late and great Leo Panitch, who passed away recently, was really stressing at the end of his life, along with some co-authors, that ultimately, like, what the left has to focus on right now is going from protest actions and protest movements into political formations, into institutions. And so it's both, I think, I think when he was saying it, it was meant as a strategic, like, this is what we have to do in order to continue attempting to take power for working people in this country and elsewhere. But I think in a kind of an unfortunate flip side, the right is also learning how to go from protest to politics, or at least there's the chance that they could, right? And so I think, what we should keep in mind, when we look at what's going on today, and what's something, I think it's an open question that I think needs to be assessed by the left and by others, is to what extent is the right organized? To what extent is this today sporadic? I think, my sense is that it wasn't a fairly organized thing, but I'm probably, I could be totally wrong on that. Again, I probably shouldn't be saying something like that on the day of. But again, I think it's something where we on the left have a moral urgency to basically get our shit in order and try to form political organizations and institutions and mobilize those that do exist to our ends, because there is the chance that the right might be able to do it at the same time that we're trying to do this. So
I think a kind of follow-up to that is there's the right and then there's the far right. So I think that the right, as in the like Koch brothers right, extremely well organized, and you can see that happening at like every state house, right? The far right is, I think, the sort of more visceral and scary part, or I think the part that takes up a lot of the media attention, as we're seeing right now, because obviously, like I said before, they often have guns. They do these very visual, kind of shocking things like storm capitals. Are they organized? That's a more difficult question to answer. But I'm wondering if you guys think, like, what do you think? How do you think the left should be responding to this? Do you think like should we be showing up at the Capitol too?
Well, I mean, and I was gonna say, I think often in a moment like this or right after Charlottesville, there's going to be like a renewed call to fight the right. Mm-hmm. And I think we should think more comprehensively about what that means. So to me, fighting the right and undermining the far right is not about just show up to a Proud Boys rally and yell at them. And I'll be honest, over the years, I've been at many rallies where I'm yelling at like 30 middle-aged white guys who are kind of pathetic. And I leave those rallies, I don't necessarily feel like I've done much to fight the right in this country. Again, I'm not saying that there aren't situations where the left should be confronting these groups, but I think when we talk about fight the right, we're like, we got to provide this alternative and really build a coalition that can be like a governing majority in this country. And, there was a lot written. I think Harvey K has probably written a lot about, like it was not impossible that in the 30s we wouldn't have fascism. I mean, that was totally on the cards. Could have happened. And I think it was the New Deal. And of course, the New Deal is limited, but that staved that off. And that's what kind of worried me about Biden's speech today. And I get the sense from what I know about the New Deal, maybe Harvey K can come on and yell at me if I'm wrong, but I think it's this sense like they were in a crisis and, it enlisted people in this project nationally. We're in this project together to, build a better life and a better alternative. And that's not what you're getting from Biden. I mean, he has the slogan, build back better. Okay. But then it's like, wear a mask. So that's the thing. I mean, we are, and I know the left every year and every day is a crisis for the left, but I really do think you can describe right now a crisis and not just in an economic sense. And we're going to need something bigger to get us out of this than, this kind of just vague calls for unity, and decency. That's just not going to cut it. And I think the New Deal is, even as limited as it is, it's the best example we have of like how we can get out of a crisis and truly avoid fascism.
Right. I think that I totally agree with what Paul's just said. I mean, the other big news today, of course, is that the Senate's the Democrats have taken control of the Senate. And so what that means is that the Democrats control all three major arms of government. Additionally, it also means that Senator Bernard Sanders is going to be the chairman of the Budget Committee. So this is, there's a big opportunity right in front of us right now in two regards. One, of course, for the just obvious, the Democrats ran on, we need to get everyone a stimulus check. We need, Biden ran on an expansion of infrastructure and a number of other important kind of expansion of public goods. And, just to the extent that any one of us as individuals can hope that the future turns out right, I'm hoping that he delivers, That being said, there's a very good chance that he doesn't deliver for a number of reasons. Part of it's just because of the way, the fact that anytime we've ever gotten anything good for working people, it really only ever happened when you had an organized working class, either labor movement or labor party or some kind of political formation that forced the hand of these elites to end up voting in the interests of working people, right? That it's really almost never happened from, elites that said, yeah, I'm going to do the right thing today. I think they deserve a little extra. It has only ever come through the left commanding power. And so, again, I would love to be, I would love for Biden to come through with what he ran on and what the Democrats ran on. I hope that many of these people are in fact sincere in what they advocated for. But my guess, if I had to place a bet right now, I'd say that we need to mobilize our side, and we need to be reaching out. We need to be pulling people to a left political project, because we're going to need more and more people on our side to get these things, to basically get concessions out of the political class, out of the economic ruling class. And so this is, and again, sweet Bernard, where he is, he's going to be giving us great opportunities in the year to come, I'm sure. And so it's going to be incumbent on us to take advantage of those opportunities.
I also want to make the point that I think that, program of expanded public goods could actually go a long way toward defanging and beating back the far right. And one example of that is in Idaho, in the 80s and 90s, the Aryan Nations, which is one of the leading white power groups at the time, had a compound in northern Idaho. And part of the way that they recruited people was to invite farmers who had been displaced by the farming crisis in the 80s to come live on the compound for free. So they basically took advantage, or they basically saw an opportunity with people who were, financially struggling with very real material hardship. And they were like, hey, come live here for free, and maybe check out this literature. And, I'm not that's not the only reason why their ranks grew. But obviously, if there had been an alternative for those farmers, rather than go live with the Nazis, that would have been a great thing. And I think would have taken a lot of wind out of the Aryan Nation sails. So.
Right. Well, the old labor slogan of, if you don't talk to them, they will.
Right. Yeah, exactly. Yeah. And I think that's borne out time and time again.
Yeah. Well, on that note, maybe it's worth it to go to Krystal now, because I think ultimately, in order to understand a lot of what's going on in any coherent way, I think, we first have to understand what populism is. And I'd like to think that, although I wasn't a part of this interview, the two people
your spirit was there,
right? It's all backwards, but
right.
The other faces on screen were, and they did a wonderful job. It's pre-recorded, but I'm going to play that in a second, unless you guys have any final thoughts.
No, we'll see how these next few days play out.
Yeah, to be continued.
Yeah.
To be continued. All right, so here's our interview with Krystal from yesterday night. Enjoy. Hold on.
So we are joined now by Krystal Ball, who, as many of you know, is a journalist and co-host of the show Rising. She's also the author of the book, The Populist's Guide to 2020, A New Right and New Left Are Rising, with her Rising co-host, Sagar and Jetty. And she's just launched a brand new podcast with Kyle Kulinski called Krystal, Kyle, and Friends. So Krystal, welcome to the Jacobin Show.
Thank you. Great to be with you guys.
Good to have you on. So I want to start by just asking you like a pretty broad question about the idea of populism. Okay. So on Rising and, in your book with Sagar, you obviously offer a left perspective. Sagar offers a more conservative perspective, but you both identify as populists. And I guess I'm curious why you chose this particular label. I know you were a Bernie supporter and, I suspect you share very similar political views to lots of Jacobin's contributors and viewers. So do you see a meaningful difference between left populism and democratic socialism? Or maybe another way of phrasing the question is, how do you define populism and why does it appeal to you?
Those are all great questions. And thank you guys again. It's so great to be with all of you and Happy New Year. I like the label left populism, not because I would also call myself a democratic socialist. I don't eschew that label. Eschew, is that how you say it? Whatsoever. But I think populism has actually a proud history in America in particular. Thomas Frank has just written a phenomenal book that's actually about the anti-populist movement, but through that lens, he tracks the history of populism in America, in the late 1800s and how there was this burgeoning coalition of farmers and laborers that was multiracial, that had some initial success in really pushing for a more equitable distribution of wealth in the countryside. And so that's kind of the tradition that I ground my views in. Like I said, I do see myself also as a democratic socialist, so I don't see like a hard line between those two things. But that's kind of why I've gravitated to that label. I also think it's probably, I like the idea of reclaiming it, because certainly in the Trump era, populism the word itself has become synonymous with fascism. And it's not synonymous with fascism. And like I said, has a really proud worker-centric, labor-centric, farmer-centric history in this country and others around the world. So I also sort of like the idea of reclaiming that term, because one of the tricks of the anti-populist movement, which would say, hey, we've got to get the elites in charge. We've got to get the people who are super credentialed, the super experts. Don't worry, they'll handle it. You rubes, just go about your business. We've got it here. One of their tricks is to take a label like populism, which has inherent in it this idea of a more sort of majoritarian politics, and make it something evil and scary. So that was really at the core of why I wanted to reclaim that term. If you read the previous book that I wrote, which is actually called Reversing the Apocalypse, which was written right after Trump is elected, I actually bought into some of that negative rhetoric around the term itself. And so if you read that, you'd be like, okay, you're saying all these terrible things about populism here, and yet you're calling yourself one over, now in the present day. And that's been a process of my own sort of learning and education and recognition of the weaponization of that term to try to quash legitimate left populist movements like the one of Bernie Sanders.
Yeah, I think one of my favorite parts of Thomas Frank's book is how he specifically defines populism as not something that's anti-democratic, but as sort of a fuller expression of democracy. And I think, just going off of what you said, that's actually a real reversal in how so much of the media has talked about populism, and especially in 2016, when, there were kind of these comparisons being made between Trump and Bernie. Agree.
Yeah, exactly right. And the conceit of our show is a little controversial, and it's sometimes a little uncomfortable, I'll be honest with you. But we have in America an incredibly polarized working class. And so, my view in starting Rising and the project that I hope that we're engaged in there is really trying to reach out to a multiracial working class audience where they fall on the political spectrum, and to target our ire less at those members of the working class who may be on the other end of the political spectrum as we are today, than at the elites who have constructed this system intentionally to divide working class people. So, like I said, sometimes that conversation is very uncomfortable. Sagar's views are the same as mine in certain areas, but very different from mine in other areas. And we try to hash that out in a way that's ultimately productive and contributes to more solidarity and less ugly tribal division that, ultimately only serves the people who already have everything.
And so kind of to follow up about this term populism, I think like both the strength and the weakness of the term is that it's a little bit vague. And I think it's a strength because it can attract people who don't identify with the left versus right binary. But I think the weakness is that its vagueness allows people who don't support a pro-worker agenda to kind of claim the mantle of populists.
Yes.
And so sometimes, to some people, it just means political outsider. And, after all, there are many corporate CEOs that are political outsiders. And, it's kind of interesting thinking about this with people like Andrew Yang and Marianne Williamson, for example. To me, they're not as clear as having a pro-working class agenda like Bernie. So do you identify people like Marianne Williamson and Andrew Yang as populists, or where do they fit in this spectrum?
That's a good question. I don't think I want to label them. Like, I think I would allow them to define themselves. What I like about, and I responded most to, I thought Bernie had the right platform and the right vision, the right understanding of what we needed to do and what the right coalition was to accomplish those things. But what I liked about Andrew and Marianne was that they both had a certain fearlessness and a certain willingness to assess the structural problems in America, even if their solutions were a little bit different than where Bernie was going. And they were willing, and to me, this is really important, they were willing to criticize the Democratic Party, and they didn't buy wholesale into this like, oh, you have to vote for the Democrat no matter how bad they are because Trump is so uniquely evil. They, ultimately they kind of got that there was this core problem that went beyond Donald Trump ultimately. And that's what I really liked and respected about both of them. And then in the marketplace of ideas, we can figure out what the best direction is. Like I said, I thought Bernie Sanders, who had this, real understanding of the importance of universal programs, the need for a multiracial working class grassroots base to ultimately have political power, and his understanding that this is really not even so much about these individual issues as important as they are, but the democratization of power. To me, that was most clear through his sort of political vision. But, I'm not sure if I would call Andrew or Marianne populist, but there is something in their view of America that I respond to. I have to say, we just, thank you for giving me the opportunity for a shameless plug by the way of the new podcast, because we just had Marianne on, and another shameless plug, we're having Bhaskar Sankara of Jacobin this week, who I'm very excited to talk to. But one of the things that I realized over the course of 2020, which, I'm unbelievably fortunate in general, and especially this year, I've been really lucky. Nobody who's close to me has gotten sick and died. I wasn't facing foreclosure. I'm able to feed my family. But, this has been a tense and I think soul-searching year for absolutely everybody. I found myself reaching more for some of the concepts and the I guess, more spiritual approach of Marianne that does look beyond, okay, what are the issues, like is Medicare for all and Green New Deal and like these policy issues that are incredibly important, to these more existential questions. I found I really responded to that. And I also sort of in self-reflection realized, and there's no excuse for this for me because I actually had met Marianne before she launched her presidential campaign, but I realized that I had fallen for some of the tricks that were used to basically dismiss her as like Looney Tunes and a kook and just push her out of the public consciousness whatsoever. When, whatever you think of her, she's a very serious person. She's been a very successful person. She's written books that millions and millions of people have bought and really responded to and found spoke to them in their heart and in their life journey. And so it was kind of like a moment too of self-reflection of like, I kind of bought into some of this crap, and I'm ashamed of myself for that, frankly. So I think for me, that piece is really important that Marianne offers. And then Andrew, I think, is really interesting because he has really, maybe more than anyone, gotten this idea of, look, people are screwed. The country is screwed because people are screwed, and we need to figure that out and grapple with that. I think Personally, I think a jobs guarantee, if you had to pick between UBI and a jobs guarantee, I'd probably take the jobs guarantee, but I don't think that they're mutually exclusive either. And so the fact that he put that on the table, and when he started running for president, it was not popular. Like, to the extent that anyone even knew what it was, they were like, I don't like that, no. And now, look, 80% of people are like, send people a $2,000 check, right? That's part of that's the pandemic, part of it's the circumstances, et cetera. But a big part of that was Andrew Yang putting that on the table. And I give him a lot of credit for that. So in that way, I think he is a populist.
Yeah. And I did wish that Bernie kind of brought up automation more, you
Yeah.
know, and use that as a way to plug the job guarantee.
Yeah, I think that's a great point.
I want to talk to you about another thorny kind of vague word that comes up with populism a lot, which is nationalism. So, you know, in conversations about populism, nationalism crops up and they kind of, in some people's imaginations, go hand in hand. And I think in one way it's really understandable because when people think of political change, they think of it on the national level within, you know, national institutions. And they start defining themselves in terms of what is possible within that. And obviously we've seen some, you know, horrible xenophobic, racist forms of nationalism or nationalist populism that crop up across the world with far-right populist leaders. But I think this same line of reasoning is behind the Bernie Bros narrative. Like, there's this specter of populist nationalism that we're told appeals only to the native sons and only helps them, and that's why they like him. So my question, I guess, is there like a type of populist nationalism that's good for the left? And at what point does acceptance or tolerance of nationalist policies or ideologies undermine or endanger the project as a whole? Because we have seen this globally. You know, you've seen things like this happen in Germany, to a lesser extent in Greece and in France. There are critiques of this in left populism across the world. And if it grows here, we will have to, you know, contend with that. So that's the first part of the question. And the second is like, is there a way to stave off those ideologies or tendencies without creating like purity test politics, which we already have a problem with on the left?
God, those are such great questions. I guess, first of all, I would say that I think this question of nationalism is where there is a real difference between left populism and right populism. Because kind of at the core of both of these theories is this idea that there are people who are screwing you. There's a system in place that is screwing you. And, you know, we need to do something about that. And so on the left, that's about, you know, where I think the real problem is that we've allowed the entire country to be run by rich people and corporations for their benefit at the expense of literally everybody else, right? That to me is the proper place to place the blame. But what you see oftentimes with a nationalist politics and a nationalist populism is there may be some of that corporate critique as well, but it's coupled with, and these people are coming and they're taking your jobs and they're, you know, changing your community and you should be terrified. And they're the ones, right? So in that way, it is a false populism because what you're doing is you're pitting working class people fundamentally against each other. And to me, that's anathema to the project. So, you know, to me, I think that's a really important distinction between how the left approaches populism and how the right approaches populism. At the same time, you know, this is something I would actually love to hear from you guys on, because it's something I'm in the process of thinking through and grappling with, and I can't say of like, here's my answer on it. But, you know, there's America, like all countries, has a very complicated story, very ugly, nasty story at times, but not uniformly ugly and nasty. There's also ideals that were present at the founding of the country that were really aspirational and really idealistic and are worth not only hanging on to, but worth claiming as our own. This is something that, Professor Harvey J.K. talks about a lot. Like, a lot of times on the left, our instinct is to say, like, we messed up with that. Like, you know, we had genocide, we had slavery, we've had all of these horrors in the past. We need to be done with all of these things and to situate ourselves outside of the context of sort of American values. I think that's a real mistake, Because again, if you're a populist, you have to meet people somewhat where they are, right? And people grow up with those that mean something to them. And there are important, beautiful pieces there that are worthy of hanging on to and celebrating, and are also important politically in terms of one of the most powerful things you can do in politics is saying, look, you said your ideal is here and you're way over here, and pointing out the gap between the ideal and how the person or the country or whatever is ultimately behaving. So if you just abandon all of American history and trash it and say it's all horrible and it's all racist and it's all evil and everybody involved with it is terrible, first of all, you're alienating most of the country. And second of all, you're denying yourself an important political tool that can be used effectively for change. So Bernie clearly somewhat recognized this in his campaign, although I don't personally think he leaned into it enough in grounding himself in New Deal and FDR legacy. There's a lot of idealism and aspiration from the founding fathers that I think can be embraced and celebrated as well. Those populist reformers, those movements are also part of American history. The unionization movement, like all of that should be embraced and celebrated as part of our heritage, so that what we want to do isn't something that's crazy and new. This is a return to American values. This is a more full embrace of the values that this country stands for at its best. So that type of, like, I guess I'd call it honest patriotism, that's not just painting over or whitewashing all of the ugliness and all of the atrocities, but also doesn't just throw it all out and say every part of it was terrible. I think that's probably the place that we ultimately need to be.
Yeah, and I think that's great. I absolutely agree with that. I think that, you know, there's this condescension that gets wrapped up into the kind of elite discourse around populism that sometimes says, you know, you're wrong for feeling proud of where you come from, right? Or you see this in a lot of critiques about, do we or do we not support the military? It's like, obviously we support the infantry of the military. We support soldiers. These are like US citizens for one, but they're working people. And, you know, there's this, I think that's where things can fall into this purity test, where it's like, you're not doing it right, you're not believing it right. And that only plays into the hands of the right, because they'll take the most grotesque iteration of that scolding and they'll be like, that's our identity now. You're scolding me for being racist, sexist, homophobic, what have you, ableist. I'm gonna, you know, fold all of that into my like media leader personality and run with it, because you've created that constituency. But you know, the left, exactly as you said, has a long history of saying like, we the people mean something to us. All men are created equal means something to us. Liberty and justice for all means something to us. You know, democracy means something to us. We do not have those things. We are charting a path towards that. And I think you're right that we've got to walk the line of being honest about our history and being honest about our values as they've emerged from our history. Because part of the evils of America have taught us why we can't go back to certain things and why we have to, you know, be vehemently against the kind of right-wing xenophobia and the worst impulses of right-wing nationalism.
Yeah, I think that's incredibly well said and incredibly true. And it's not just the right who will use like the most sort of like weird, you know, excessive outrage on the left against us. Like that's how neoliberals also say, look, these people aren't serious. Like what they're saying will appeal to 1% of people. You can't work with these people. You can't have these people in power. You can't run these people for office. Like they're just not serious. So forget about it.
I think it was Michael Harrington. You could call him a founding father of DSA, who said, you know, how are you going to organize people to change a country when your starting point is, I hate this country? You know, I don't think that really, and I think there's a easy way we can reframe. When we say the country, we're not talking about the national security state. We're talking about the working class majority that built this country, you know, and we as a country can do great things.
Yeah, I think that's really, I think we have to live in the reality. Like, you know, for so long, the left has been largely irrelevant. So we could kind of afford to have like, you know, when you're out in the wilderness completely, then it makes sense to have these like super intellectual kind of niche debates, because they're not meant for a broad audience. They're meant to figure out your core and figure out your values and figure out where to stand and what the most idealized version of your ideology is. Now we're in this transitional phase. And I think that part of why we see such a like post Bernie, it's just like vicious fracturing, horrifying, like people that I love at each other's throats. I think it's partly because we're in this transitional phase from being in the wilderness to trying to be relevant and trying to actually like put things into practice. And what does it look like to actually wield power and use some of the little tricks of leverage that we have? What does it look like to really try to appeal to a broad mass audience and not just the, you know, the idealized version, but how we put it into language and concrete facts that people can really relate to, because the values that we stand for are incredibly popular, are incredibly majoritarian. Sometimes the way that we approach the debate and talk about them isn't always that way. So I guess in my more centered moments, that's how I look at the period that we're in. Is like, this is not almost inevitable, and I hope ultimately fruitful path to get to a place where we make that transition from in the wilderness talking to ourselves to actually having a relevant role in American politics.
So I want to pick up on that thread of, you know, putting these ideas into practice. I 100% agree with everything that you just said. And I think a question that I keep coming back to when it comes to populism is kind of this bridging between left populism and right populism. So in recent political news, of course, a few weeks ago, Bernie Sanders and Josh Hawley kind of famously worked together in the Senate to try to press for $2,000 stimulus checks. That was unsuccessful, but they did get $600 through. So that seemed like, you know, half a win maybe.
Right.
But more recently, since then, Josh Hawley has kind of gone off on a tear where, you know, now he's saying he wants to reject the electoral college results, or he wants to challenge those this week. And, you know, to me, that seems very anti-democratic, and that seems like a betrayal of his so-called populist values. So again, I guess to go back to, you know, some of the themes you were talking about earlier, where, you know, obviously you and Sagar don't agree on every single point, especially when it comes to things like nationalism or who constitutes the working class, or like how far, you know, that definition should reach. But you probably agree on more than you disagree on, right? I mean, I think you've said that before on the show. Yeah. So I guess the question is like, when it comes to policy, or when it comes to building political coalitions, like outside of the show, do you see an opportunity for the left to work with right populists?
Ideally, yes. And I think the Hawley Bernie thing is a perfect example, right? I think the fact that you had, I think it was 43 Republicans in the House and a decent number in the Senate, including these two morons who are up for re-election right now, embrace the idea of $2,000 checks shows some possibility, because as you know, certainly if Hillary Clinton was president or under the Barack Obama administration, there is no way in hell that any Republican would have supported such a thing. So that is progress in a certain extent, even as it's sort of, you know, it's sad that the bar is so incredibly low. But if you're asking me, do I think that any of these like people in Washington are truly on the right, are truly representatives of the people? No. I mean, Josh Hawley is like voted for anti-union crap. He voted for the Trump tax cut mess for corporations. Now he's going along for political benefit, he thinks, with this electoral college nonsense. But if he wants to vote for $2,000 checks, I want Bernie to work with him, and I want us to encourage that, you know, that alliance. And I don't want to rule it out to be by being like, you're supporting fascism, et cetera, et cetera. If it's an alliance that's going to get people $2,000 checks, then I am 100% for it. So do I see him as like some kind of genuine emblem of populism? No, absolutely not. Do I think that sometimes his cynical political motives may align him in a fruitful and useful way with actual economic populists? Yeah, I think that may occasionally happen, and we should seize on those opportunities. One thing I do want to say in Sagar's defense, and you didn't attack Sagar, but he gets attacked a lot. So I do want to say this, is that sometimes it's justified, but sometimes the thing that really pisses me off and on his behalf and pisses me off when it happens to me is people will assume that he's exactly like Josh Hawley, that he supports exactly what Tucker Carlson supports, that he supports exactly what Donald Trump supports. And he doesn't, right? Sagar was very excited about the $2,000 checks. Sagar is disgusted with the ridiculous stop the steal nonsense and routinely goes after people, even people like Josh Hawley, who's been, an ally in a way to Sagar in certain respects on the show. So I would just ask people to judge everyone, myself, you guys, my co-hosts, et cetera, by their actual positions, rather than doing this concentric circles of like, you're associated with this person, or you've said one positive thing about that person, so therefore you're now responsible for every single thing that they say or do, which is again another way that I think we just ultimately sort of destroy ourselves and end up self-immolating.
Yeah, I think your point about Sagar, for anyone who watches the show, is probably really clear. Like, I was going to say, I feel like I probably agree with Sagar like 99% of the time, actually. We won't do percentages, but again, like, I think that there's more overlap than there is disagreement. And the times that you do disagree, I think are really, really clear on the show and, really thoughtful and kind of like discussed in a fruitful way. Well,
and look, you probably agree with Sagar in the totality of Sagar's views. You probably agree with him less than what is presented on the show. Mm-hmm. But part of the goal of the show is to show some of this overlap and to show what is possible, because look, the current establishment corporate Republicans, like, I don't agree with them on anything, right? I don't agree with them on war. I don't agree with them on taxes. I don't agree with them on wages. I don't agree with them on unions. I don't agree with them on corporate control. I don't agree with them on any social issue. I don't agree with them on anything. There are some libertarians who I agree with, on like national security, state, civil libertarian issues. Okay, that's good. That's fruitful. Happy to work with Rand Paul or whoever, where that's useful. But I do actually think it would be more fruitful if you had some some people on the right who ran as Republicans who truly represented that view that Sagar holds. And maybe the group in the country that is least represented in all of politics is the economic left, cultural right, which is a broad swath of the population. And it does not exist in terms of elected office, right? It's just people who are pandering to the cultural and identity, like white anxiety part of the right, and then selling them out on the corporate side. Like, that's the entirety of the Republican Party here. And I think it would be a lot better for everybody if there was some representation of that very common view of economically left and culturally right.
Again, about this populist right, there's been a lot of chatter recently about the Republican Party becoming a workers' party. Mm-hmm. I don't know about you, Krystal. I'm so excited we finally have a Labor Party. Now, certainly Trump didn't get the memo because, as you often say on your show, Trump has actually governed like a Bush-era Chamber of Commerce Republican in everything that he's done. And I've actually written for Jacobin some about all that he's done to attack unions and attack labor. But, where do you see this going overall? Like, will the Republicans actually be able to pass some pro-worker policies, or maybe enough to keep just enough of a working class base? Or are they just going to make rhetorical gestures and make this all about the culture war?
Today, because for a variety of reasons, including that no one is actually interested in governing, they're more interested in pretending to govern, creating tricky legislative maneuvers to act like they're doing something, but not really do something. And because, it is truly a gridlocked system in terms of positive things, if they want to pass another bad trade deal or go to another war, you'll have plenty of bipartisan support for that. But because of the nature of that, politics has basically collapsed down to kind of cultural signaling. And, so let me tell a short story and then I'll answer your question more directly. One of my family stories is my sister, when she was little, asked my dad who he loved the most of me and my two sisters. And he said, well, I can't say that. I can't tell you, like, that's not a thing. And she said, well, who do you hate the least? And so I think people have a choice where they're like, who do I hate the least, right? And so in that way, do I think the Republicans are going to become some worker party? Like, no, obviously not. You know, they're out here. Trumpism has become just about how ridiculous you're willing to go on like Dominion voting machines and Hugo Chavez stealing the election from the grave. And the further you're willing to go, the more true you are to that legacy. And so any idea that Trumpism was going to end up about any policy idea, even ones that are like anathema to us, like his stance on immigration, it's not about anything. It's just about this like nonsense and how far you're willing to go to demonstrate your loyalty. That's it. So that's what the Republican Party is about. And, you know, filling in the blanks is the corporate interests and the donor class that always fill in the blanks and anyway are happy with the status quo because it already serves their interests completely perfectly. But I do think Democrats have a real problem because they give off this incredible air of contempt and condescension, and we know better, and we're going to get the experts in charge and the credentialed, you know, people with the Ivy League degrees are going to handle this, and you all are kind of a bunch of morons. And so we've got this, and we're just going to assume that if you're black and brown, you have to show up to vote for us. We're not going to do anything to actually like improve your material conditions. We're going to kind of like look down our nose at you to the extent that we bother to campaign for in your communities at all. And do I think that that will continue to contribute to this rural urban? And I think the most significant divide is college educated, non-college educated split. Yeah, I do, because the only thing you get in politics is cultural signaling. Like that's all it is right now. It's not actually getting anything done for people that they can see in their lives. So if you have one party that, you know, at least feels like they're sort of pandering to you and isn't looking like at you like you're a moron, and another party that has this like elitist contempt just oozing out of their pores, I don't know. I think people are going to continue to drift in the Republican Party direction so long as that's the case. So it's not that neither party is set to become a workers' party. I think if you had to pick one that's more likely to, I think you've got more to work with on the Democratic side. But obviously that's, you know, a long way from reality. But I do think that this realignment and this shift, I don't want to overstate it. It's not going to like miraculously happen overnight, or anti-miraculously, I guess, happen overnight. But I do think that shift of non-college voters, regardless of race, shifting into the Republican Party is going to continue.
And there was a revealing quote recently, Marco Rubio, you know, there's an article, the headline, he's saying we're a workers' party. And then when you read a little bit further, he says, you know, we're the party for people who don't think, you know, there should be riots every time someone disagrees with someone. So clearly it's a culture workers' party, you know, nothing in there about this means raising the minimum wage or union jobs or infrastructure. So clearly when they say workers' party, they're still thinking on the terms of culture. But like you said, that could be enough ultimately.
Yeah, well, that's all that's there right now. You know, and so I think this sense of who has contempt for me, who has the most contempt for me, is to me one of the most animating forces in politics today.
Right.
Yeah, I wanted to follow up about that point about elitism, because there are many, many forms of anti-elitism in the United States, and some of those are progressive, right? Tax the rich, we're the 99%. Anybody, you know, getting mad at the Whole Foods CEO for being like, you don't need healthcare, you need to eat vegetables. But then, you know, we also see the kind of far right or conspiratorial anti-elitism, like anti-science conspiracies around the virus or climate change. So on the left, we obviously want people to have healthcare. We want people to have access to the vaccine. We want, you know, a world where we're actively fighting climate change and mitigating its effects. But we have to contend to the real elitism of some of these more well-established narratives, and the fact that the mistrust that undergirds the reaction against them is rooted in something real, right? Like, we may want to claim science for the left. It is people, human beings, that created this field and keep on endeavoring and expanding it. But we can't do that if we fall back into the same elitist tropes of, I believe in science, you're bad if you don't believe in science. So how do we reclaim some of these things toward a progressive populist end?
I mean, it's a really good question, and I think a really tricky one, because I try to be, and Sagar does as well, really careful on Rising to not do this thing like during coronavirus. There's been all this like COVID shaming of like, look at these people, there's 12 of them in a room, like how could they? And or even the anti-lockdown protesters at the beginning who came out, and there was, I mean, people lost their minds about that. And I get that, right? I understand that reaction, but I also understand that people feel like this is a real threat to their livelihood, and they have zero trust in government for justified reasons, zero trust in the media for justified reasons. Like, I can understand how you get to that place. And I don't think just like sneering at a person is the way to convince them that their actions are ultimately harmful and not going to get them where they want to go. So it's really challenging. And I think, you know, the way that I've tried to approach it and the way we've tried to approach it is just treating people respectfully and presenting the facts as best we find them, and being really honest when, like, Anthony Fauci lied about wearing masks at the beginning of this crisis. He did. And that was a disaster. And he has recently lied about herd immunity. He admitted that the beginning of the crisis, he thought he could only say, like, we only need 50 to 60% herd immunity to you know, or inoculations to have herd immunity. And then he admitted, as the polls changed and he felt the public appetite to hear the true number increased, then he started giving people the real truth that the number is more like 90%. We didn't ask you for your assessment of public polling data. We asked you for the honest facts. Like, the whole trust the science thing goes out the window when you have actors like that who are making it up and treating, again, you with contempt in this sort of like, you know, very patriarchal way of, I know best, so don't worry, and let me try to manage the emotions of the American people. So we try to treat with respect how people to get to some of the views that they hold, even if those views can seem on the surface absurd, ridiculous, etc. Because again, I don't think it's productive to just sneer at someone and say, you're stupid, like you're ridiculous. That's only gonna make them harder and more firm in their views. So I'll give you a concrete example. I mean, we talked about the Fauci thing, obviously, but with all the Trump insanity over the election and the lawsuits and this incredibly fraught period that our country has been going through post-election, we would go through, and it was a little tedious. I'm sure people found it a little boring, but people also really liked it and appreciated it. We went through every lawsuit and we're like, here's what they presented, here's the result. Even if they won, here's how many votes would be thrown out. That's not enough to change the result in Pennsylvania. Let's go through the next one. We spent weeks keeping track of all of these lawsuits so that our audience, which is ideologically diverse, something I'm really proud of and I think is really unusual. So our audience that's on the right feels like their concerns are being taken seriously and we're not just dismissing it out of hand. We're going through the facts as have been presented by Trump's lawyers in courts. So they feel like we're taking it seriously. And actually on the left, people really appreciated it too, because this was a very scary time of like, dear God, what are they planning and what's going on and could it work? And so by us going through and saying they lost another one, they're now 0 for 38 or whatever the tally was, that also lowered the temperature there, where they also better understood what was actually happening and what the true nature of the threat was. So, you know, I guess it sounds really basic, but we just try to treat people respectfully, understand how they came, how they justifiably lost trust in every single institution in this country. Like, I understand why you have no trust in those institutions. And then to respectfully present, you know, the facts as best as we can, and be honest, whether it's Republicans who are messing up or Democrats who are messing up or Bernie Sanders who's messing up or Anthony Fauci who's messing up or whoever it is, and also give credit where it's due. So, I mean, I guess it sounds a little Pollyanna, but that's really been my approach to it. And I think it has been, I actually think it's been sort of successful from the responses we've seen and the feedback that we've gotten.
Yeah, I don't think it's Pollyannish at all. Oh, sorry, Jen.
Yeah, no,
I
we're
was just
fans.
gonna say, you know, we've got like the Democrats on the one hand treating you like an overbearing dad, right? Very paternalistically, like, you idiots, put your masks on. How can you not
Not even a
listen to
cool
this?
dad.
Yeah, not even a cool dad.
A nerd
Dad
dad.
means supreme. I'm looking at you, Barack Obama. And then we've got the Republicans who are like, you know, very divorced dad. Do whatever you want. It's cool. I only see you on the weekend. I don't care if
You don't have
eat
to wear a
Cheetos
mask.
I don't care if you eat Cheetos all day. I don't have to deal with your stomach ache. So it's sad, but it is novel to just respectfully engage with people and provide them the information. And part of the media's role is to do that work. You know, a regular person can't read through court documents all day long.
Right, exactly. And you see all this news that is, you know, after the election, like everybody's grandma was terrified, regardless of which side they were on. The like Trump grandmas are still terrified because they think that the election's been stolen and the country is over, right? And the Democratic grandmas were terrified because Trump was going to call in the military and steal the ballot boxes and like all of that. And so we just tried to go through like, here's what's really happening. And that's not to say that this stuff isn't dangerous and doesn't have massive consequences, because I absolutely think it does. And we're certainly not out of the woods yet, but just here's what's happening. Here's what the outcome is going to be. Here's what to expect. And the other piece is to really, because what you just said, Ariella, is really important. Like, ordinary people don't have time to, what they rely on is like, here's some people that I trust and here's what they're saying. And so that's why it's such an abuse and so outrageous to me. The people like Holly and Cruz, especially the ones who really are smart enough to, who know better, like they know this election wasn't stolen. They know that like all this is crap. They 100% know that. And yet they are willing to like mislead and delude the people who trust them. Like if you have someone who puts their trust, you know, that's a sacred thing. And you're willing to just like do whatever for your own, like based on your own political calculus, no matter how big of a lie and how much you're debasing yourself over that. I mean, I find that a really outrageous abuse of trust. And so we really try to lay the blame where I think it belongs, which is that people like that who abuse the trust, and who, by the way, when they do that and people come to realize they've been misled, that just contributes to this cycle of more institutional mistrust and more embrace of, you know, I don't even like the term conspiracy theories because some of conspiracy theories are true, but embrace of more like wild fringe ideas that ultimately are counterproductive and don't provide people with the real meaning in their lives that they ultimately need and deserve, and don't train their focus on the places where they could actually achieve, you know, an improved condition for themselves and more meaning and purpose within their own lives.
So I want to quickly follow up on some of your comments about the media and ask you about, I guess, what I sort of unofficially call the populist media ecosystem. This is a very unofficial designation, but this is what I call basically, you know, the Young Turks and Kyle Kulinski's Secular Talk Show, and the Michael Brooks Show, and of course Rising. And I think of this constellation, I guess, as very distinct from the legacy media. Even Rising, even though, you know, you guys are part of The Hill, I think of you as kind of like alternative media. Yeah. And just to give sort of an example, I worked briefly at a legacy print publication, and all of the editors and journalists there were like, you know, hyper attuned to everything that happened in like New York and DC media. Like they knew everything that was going on at like Harper's and like, I don't know, like Vogue and like the New York Times. And none of these people had ever heard of Kyle Kulinski or Michael Brooks. They only sort of vaguely knew Rising or the Young Turks. But the irony is that all of you guys have huge audiences. Like I bet that Kyle Kulinski, like one of his videos gets more views than Harper's has subscribers, right? So it's in a way this like almost alternate universe. And I guess my question for you is, what do you see the role of this alternative media being over the next 4 years or even over the long term?
So here's my sort of generalized media theory, which may be biased by, my previous role at MSNBC, but you're absolutely right. There is zero awareness of what is going on in this large and growing left media ecosystem, right? Like zero awareness. And the unfortunate thing is that without having some elite awareness, you really aren't relevant to the changing the conversation among people who actually hold power. Now that's starting to change. Just because the space has grown so large and it's become more interesting to people, and Bernie Sanders helped put that on the map. And then you also have people like the Squad who are coming in, who are kind of more of that ecosystem. So they have that provides more connectivity between elite spaces and this media ecosystem. And I really think you have to have both. I mean, one of the, again, brutal learnings of 2020 was just how powerful the mainstream media really is, especially on the left. Less so on the right, actually, because on the right, even though you have more consolidated power in Fox News, there's this entrenched media skepticism that has been, fomented and watered and fed for years and years and years. On the left, people like the media. They like the New York Times. They like the Washington Post. They like ABC and NBC and MSNBC and CNN and all these places. So and again, this is like, they use these media figures to really trust them and parse through the data and tell them if Russia is really owns Donald Trump, or if Joe Biden really is the most electable candidate. Gosh, MSNBC said he is, so I guess I got to vote for him, right? And so I really think more than anything, like the media made Joe Biden the Democratic nominee. And once they decided this is the last bulwark against Bernie Sanders, and we have to get this guy through, and all fell in line behind him and made this case of like, you can't vote for Bernie because he's going to lose. Joe's the electable one. He's the one that can beat Trump. It was all over. There was nothing that could be done. So that really demonstrated that these legacy media spaces, although they are sclerotic and uninteresting and sort of terrible and all of those things, they still have a lot of power on the left. So I think you have to play both games. I think you have to have the grassroots support, but you also have to have elite awareness of that grassroots support. And that's the only way that you ultimately have any power in the space.
So my next question is kind of related to this, and there's kind of two parts to it, but it has to do with like the left's infrastructure. So the right wing has done a great job of building a vast infrastructure for their agenda over decades, like think tanks, media outlets, talk radio, front groups. And I think, on the one hand, it should be said that it's a lot easier to do that when you have capital on your side and you have the money and the resources.
Sure.
But one question is, how can the populist left do this? What should our infrastructure look like in the future? And the second part, I think a key part of our infrastructure has to be the labor movement. And a lot of people, including myself, we always like to say, we can't really turn things around until we rebuild the labor movement and workers start taking more action, which I think is largely true, but it's not the only piece of the puzzle. And one thing I've been thinking about is how can the populist left, which at this moment is mostly electorally focused at the moment, how can it kind of from outside the labor movement maybe help to stimulate activity within labor, kind of from the outside, or electorally, kind of fan the flames to get that going again?
Yeah, it's a great question. And I think you have to think of all of these pieces in terms of their strengths and in terms of their potential roles, right? So like our show, Kyle's show, Michael Brooks' show, they were all phenomenal popularizers of ideas, right? Like making it accessible, making people understand why this is important, and then providing some of the avenues to then put pressure on elected officials or advocate for change. But it's not all going to come out of the media ecosystem, right? And that's where we're really weak. And that's why, in some ways, a lot of what we have right now is this online ability to cause a lot of fuss and like make people really uncomfortable is probably the strongest tool that we have right now, since we don't actually have real institutional power. So I think in terms of your question around, you know, rebuilding the labor movement, which I 100% agree is like the absolute key to any sort of like class-based movement. I mean, these are the spaces where workers across genders and races, in the most idealized way at least, are in communication, are in solidarity, where solidarity is even a value. I mean, my God, solidarity doesn't exist anywhere else in America.
Right.
Like, it's very rare to find solidarity anywhere. So I agree with your assessment that that's like a critical piece. And so I think the job of those of us really, you know, focused in the media space is to help not just popularize that notion, but to really focus on it and make it tangible and actionable, so that when there are opportunities, like for example, if the squad is willing to like withhold their vote, squad plus a few people withhold their vote on everything until Joe Biden makes this provision, like to improve organizing, that's the thing that we should be pushing for. Like, we should prioritize those types of actions as much as we're prioritizing Medicare for all and Green New Deal and other things. So, and I don't think we've done a good job of that. I really try to, you know, my politics, like my political formation came a lot through knowledge of the labor movement and through some great union buddies who really helped to educate me, frankly. So it's really core to my sort of political identity and awareness. But I do think it's an area where, because it's been so decimated, it doesn't feel tangible or concrete or like relevant to people. And so I think changing that, popularizing it, and then providing avenues and connectivity between like actions that can be taken to actually measurably move the ball forward is probably the right place to be.
Yeah. And also, I mean, I appreciate on your show, it's one of the few media places where you actually bring on union leaders, you know, like MSNBC rarely will bring on someone from the labor movement to talk about things.
Yeah, or if they do, it's like to endorse Joe Biden. You know?
Right, exactly.
Like,
yeah.
Let me get the worst possible labor leader who's like never worked on the shop floor and bring him on to endorse Joe Biden.
Right.
Occasionally, I will say.
Middle class Joe. There you go.
He takes the train, guys. He takes
That's
the
true.
train.
Oh my God. Yeah, that's right. Hunter served on the Amtrak board because he takes the train.
Yeah. A serious working man taking the train. On that note, actually, we have to wrap up now. But for the last question, I wanted to ask you what your kind of favorite moment of pseudo-populist gesture from either party has been. It could be Joe Biden taking the train, actually.
Wait, so like a fake populist moment?
Yeah, I think they all have these kinds of fake populist gestures, like especially on the campaign trail, where they'll be like, I met a quadruple amputee who served in Iraq, who works at a McDonald's, and they told me, they always have, or this is Bev. Bev's a good friend of mine from Atlanta, Georgia. She's a single mother of 5 who, you know, like,
your name was
fosters
popcorn.
rats. Yeah. Yeah.
Not corn pop, popcorn.
Corn pop.
Corn pop.
Actually, you know what was even better? Because corn pop, they actually looked him up. He was a real guy.
Yeah, that's true.
Actually panned out. Strange as it is to say. What was the Cory Booker T-Bone story, though?
Oh,
I think that was definitely a lie. That was definitely not a thing.
That one didn't work out. That's a good one. I mean, Kamala Harris, this is like, you know, her freedom story recently that she lifted from. Did you guys see this? She told this story. Oh, this is great.
Oh, please tell me.
So I don't know if you remember, she did an Elle magazine profile, very glossy, like, you know, and all the questions just make you want to barf because they're all so like, tell me how amazing you are. So she tells a story, all these stories about like her upbringing and how she's really proud of her parents' involvement in the civil rights movement. She tells this one story about how she was fussing in the stroller and her mom looks down and says, Kamala, baby, what do you want? What do you need? And Kamala says, freedom. Well, it turns out, Martin Luther King Jr. told the identical story in a magazine
Wow.
profile in Playboy, like back in the 60s. Identical story. Interesting.
How
But
do these
the
people
twist
not
is-
know we're going to find this out?
I think
How do
the
they not
Yeah,
know?
we have the internet now.
Right. Like,
Yeah.
I think they still are.
Wait, how do you think you're going to get away with this? Wait, what's funny is actually when the profile dropped, because this was a while ago, this is like a couple months ago, I think right after the election that this profile was done. And nobody noticed until some enterprising reporter dug it up and was like, interesting, very similar. Only in MLK's story, it was Feedom, F-E-E, rather than Freedom. So maybe that's...
But, you know, he said that about her in his story. That's where it all comes back. Yeah,
Right.
There you go.
Prescient.
There you go. We've got a K-Hive stand over here.
I will say
I'm
that.
going to get attacked now. This is why I'm not on Twitter.
I will say that in terms of gestures, I always say, if you would have shown me the photo of the kente cloth kneeling in like 2015, I'm like, that's got to be a meme. That's got to be Photoshop. There's no way that actually happened. And
Okay.
That actually happened.
That reminds me of another favorite moment, which was Elizabeth Warren at the DNC with the Black Lives Matter blocks.
Oh, yes,
Behind
yes,
her.
yes.
Everyone's like, oh my God, she's so amazing. I'm like, what?
The blocks just happen to be like that, actually.
How are you
That's the-
impressed with this?
That's the most politically effective thing she's done, I think. Where is she?
But
Like,
she's
what's she
disappeared,
doing?
right? Completely.
Yeah,
Yeah, we haven't seen her since the
Standing
blocks.
in a preschool with a set of blocks that say "Get the vaccine."
I think, I mean, in all honesty, I'm sure it's just so sad. Like, it's so apparent from the outside. She really thought she could play the institutional power inside game. And you know, she kept Larry Summers from being, you know, an Obama administration appointee. And she was occasionally critical of the Obama administration. And that's it. They're never going to listen to you. They're never going to give you a position of power. Like, it's never going to happen. And it's just so sad to see how she keeps going back to the well and stabbing the left of the back time and time again in hopes that she's going to get this inside track. And I'm sure that's what's going on now. She doesn't want to screw up whatever relationship she has with the Biden administration. So like when $2,000 checks are on the table, she's silent. She doesn't say a word. I mean, it really is sad because I used to love her. I mean, I had so much respect for her. I wanted her to run for president. I mean, she was like, I was all about it. And then you see this now, and you're like, what happened?
Yeah.
And it only works when you actually share the establishment's ideology.
It does.
You know, like that's the only way they're going to give you an inside position.
They're very clear about you being the enemy. Like, you need to be just as clear that they're the enemy. And unfortunately, I do think, look, I this isn't an excuse, but I sympathize with, it's human nature to, once you're in a group with these are my colleagues and we're getting lunch and we're friends, we're texting and all this stuff, like, it's hard to maintain that adversarial posture. And so I think that explains a lot of what you see of how some of the most, you know, fearless fighters over time in Washington, suddenly they all sort of meld into one indistinguishable blob. And I think that's why.
But on the other hand, we have Bernie Sanders speaking to the New York Times and telling journalists he's not going to call them on their birthday. So
very unique person, that one.
I didn't stay so good for so long. I just don't get it.
It's rare to have. Oh, sorry, Jen.
No, go ahead.
I was just going to say it's rare to have somebody, you know, who believes that they're doing good, not think that the horse trading and everything is always justified. You see it spiral and spiral because it's like, I'll make this concession here because, like, I'm right, I'm good, I should get this power. And you can watch it just degrade any political action that could possibly happen.
Look, it's the road to Clintonism, right? I mean, I believe that Hillary and Bill like really believe some stuff. When you see those pictures of them, they're so young, they look so idealistic. And then, yeah, it's the road to hell because you think that whatever you do to get into power is justified because you're so good, you're so smart, you're so well-intentioned. Like, if I can just get that golden ring, then it's really going to be good for the people. And that's the road to hell. And that's the road to what we have.
Saxophone's a good pseudo-populism, though, especially for
That's
the
right.
90s.
Very good.
At least there's some real talent to that, but I digress.
All of them in their jeans in Iowa. That's
Yeah, eating corn dogs.
that was one of the things I respected about Trump is he would still wear his suits and like bring his helicopter and whatever. I kind of appreciated that actually.
Well, on that note, I think we should probably let you go since we're at the hour. But do you have any last podcast plugs you want to make, or?
Yes, I do. Well, you let me make them earlier, but I'll make them again. So Krystal, Kyle, and Friends, it's up on Substack. So the first 3 episodes we're also posting on Kyle's YouTube channel, Secular Talk, so that you can check the whole thing out. The audio will always be 100% free, available in all the places. And completely advertisement free. So the only way, if you want to support the show, it's subscribe on Substack and you'll get the video and you'll get it a day earlier than the audio. So that's the deal. This week, as I said, we have Jacobin's own Bhaskar Sankara on. I'm really excited to talk to him because I think what I'm really excited to dig into with him is like the beginning of Jacobin to now and how things have changed. And because Jacobin's been very formative for me as well. And just like creating this space of, oh my God, I'm allowed to think that? Wait a second, honestly, like I didn't think that was in the realm of like acceptable thought. So it really stretched and pushed me. So I want to dig into that with him this Friday.
Cool. Well, we're definitely looking forward to it. And thank you again so much for coming on the show today.
Oh, it's my pleasure. Thank you guys. Appreciate you all.
Thanks, Krystal.
Thanks.
All right. Well, that was our interview with Krystal. Again, it was pre-recorded from yesterday, so that's why there's nothing about all the stuff that's going on today. Oh, Jen, you're muted.
Sorry, just saying, I thought that was a really fun interview. I really enjoyed speaking with Krystal. And again, I think, she sort of touched on a lot of the same themes that we've been talking about today with what's been going on at the Capitol.
Right.
Yeah.
On that note, while the interview was playing, I guess George W. Bush weighed in on what has been happening. And I want to read this quote from him. So, Bush has come out and he said about the protesters storming the Capitol, "This is how election results are disputed in a banana republic, not our democratic republic. I am appalled by the reckless behavior of some political leaders since the election and by the lack of respect shown today for our institutions, our traditions, and our law enforcement. The violent assault on the Capitol and disruption of a constitutionally mandated meeting of Congress was undertaken by people whose passions have been inflamed by falsehoods and false hopes."
If you're going to steal an election, do it with some civility, like he did.
Like he did,
Come
exactly.
on, respect the process.
And he also knows how elections go in banana republics.
Mm-hmm. Exactly.
But
And
I
knows
was
a
waiting
thing
for
about violating the Constitution as well. So I guess he's the expert here.
Right. I was waiting for his take. That's why I didn't have strong views at the beginning, because I kind of wanted to situate what I said. I take my cues from him.
Yeah, but now that he's weighed in, you know that what happened was bad.
Yeah. I was on the fence, but I'm glad.
So I want to plug next week's show because we are actually having Felix Biederman on, and he is going to be talking to us about the Bush years, coincidentally, and the Iraq War and the kind of Bush amnesia that sort of swept the nation when Trump was elected. So please tune in next week. Yeah,
and we just want to, say to everyone out there watching, hope you're safe, hope you're well. This was a pretty unfortunate and pretty awful day, all things considered. And, it's going to pass, and there will be a time when there won't be protesters in the Capitol. But there's always, I think, like we are now in a moment where there is, of course, a threat of the right. And but the thing that we have to keep in mind is that the way that historically the left has successfully dealt with that threat is through collective organizing, through collective action, through building left political institutions, because capital can, capital is one thing. Capital can, it can lob everything possible at us. protesters eventually have to go home at night. Even right-wing protesters, even, AstroTurfed Koch brothers funded protesters have to go home at night. But what we need to do ultimately is actually build an organized left that can not only like prevent incidents like today, where we actually have a functioning democracy with functioning political institutions. We also have to build, a political project that can address basically that that rot, that we actually build. Am I just repeating the same point? We need like ultimately like the way that historically we have defeated fascism, like in this country, is through what Paul was saying a moment earlier, that it's through building public works projects. It's by creating solidarity amongst people, especially in rural parts of the country that have felt left behind. Again, we might not win every single small business owner. That might not be within the scope of our project. But, there are a lot of people that, we have to be reaching out to, not because we're going to agree on everything, but because we can find, we can agree on healthcare, and that might be the way to transform, someone's political ideology from one of bigotry into one of solidarity. So I wanted to just end on, I don't know, I'm giving you the hopefully something.
The leftist halftime speech.
Sure. Right.
Paul, any parting words from you?
Well, I think something Marxism teaches us as a part, even maybe from the ideology of populism, is that, bourgeois democracy is always fragile and always expendable. And we should never forget, like, capital does not have to put up with democracy. And I think, but that doesn't change anything from what Cale said, like what our tasks are ahead. And I'll just reiterate, I think when we say fight the right, let's think comprehensively about that. Not just, don't focus too much on the Proud Boys, but like, how are we going to build the alternative that could be, like a durable governing majority in this country?
And don't give Bush a pass.
Right. Don't yearn for the days of Bush.
All right. Well, on that note, thanks to everyone for watching. Like Cale said, please stay safe, and we'll see you next week.
And press like.
Hi, everyone.
Press subscribe. Share us.
All right. That's right.
Have a good night.
Bye, everyone.